The neighborhood of Cedar Pines was a picture of manicured order. Lawns were trimmed with military precision, driveways were scrubbed spotless, and fences gleamed in uniform shades approved by the homeowners association. To outsiders, it looked like stability, a quiet suburban dream. But beneath the carefully painted surfaces was tension born from rules that never seemed to bend, only break those who resisted. For Marcus Green, a proud black homeowner in his mid-40s, Cedar Pines had once seemed like a promise fulfilled. He had worked hard, saved carefully, and finally bought his family a home in a neighborhood that was supposed to represent safety and opportunity. He remembered the joy in his wife Denise's eyes when they first walked through the front door, the laughter of their 2 kids echoing across the empty living room. It was supposed to be their sanctuary. But sanctuaries can be invaded in ways no one expects. It all began with a fence. The wooden panels that lined Marcus's backyard had weathered years of storms and sun, and when the time came to refresh it, Marcus saw an opportunity. He didn't want the pale beige the HOA recommended, the bland shade that seemed designed to erase individuality. He chose a deep, rich shade of blue, bold and striking, a color that reflected pride, strength, and creativity. It wasn't garish, it wasn't offensive, it was simply different. But in Cedar Pines, different was dangerous. The letter arrived within days. A formal notice from the HOA, printed in heavy type and signed by the board president, informing Marcus that his fence violated the community's approved palette. The letter carried more than words. It carried accusation, threat, and insult. To Marcus, it was as if his decision to paint his own property had been treated as an act of rebellion. At first, Marcus tried to reason. He had paid his dues faithfully, kept his lawn neat, and followed every rule until now. The fence was his, and the color hurt no one. But the HOA wasn't listening. They weren't interested in understanding. They wanted compliance. Soon the letters turned into fines. Each notice carried a dollar amount, stacking higher and higher until Marcus realized the HOA wasn't going to stop. They were determined to grind him down, to make an example of him. The unspoken message was clear: your choices don't matter here. Your voice doesn't matter here. Marcus felt the weight of it every time he drove home from work. His fence, once a symbol of pride, now stood as a daily reminder of conflict. Neighbors whispered, some sympathetic, others smug. A few told him quietly that they admired the color, but no one dared speak up in public. The HOA thrived on silence, and silence is what they got. But Marcus wasn't built for silence. Growing up in a world where he had often been told where he could and couldn't stand, what he could and couldn't say, Marcus had learned resilience the hard way. The fence became more than a home improvement project. It became a line drawn in the sand. If the HOA wanted a fight, Marcus wasn't going to give them quiet surrender. He was going to give them something they couldn't ignore. The idea came to him one night as he stared at the wooden panels under the glow of a street lamp. If they insisted on making the fence a battleground, then he would turn it into a statement. Something louder than fines. Something bigger than their control. With paintbrush in hand, Marcus transformed his backyard into a canvas. At first, he worked cautiously, sketching outlines, blending colors, testing strokes. But soon the fence began to come alive, each plank carrying more than pigment. He painted bold images, satirical caricatures of HOA board members with exaggerated expressions of scorn, phrases that mocked their obsession with control, symbols of community pride that stood in contrast to their rigid rules. The mural grew, stretching across the entire fence line, impossible to miss. It was humorous, biting, and deeply personal. The HOA had tried to erase his individuality, but Marcus turned their restrictions into a billboard of resistance. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Children laughed at the cartoonish faces painted on the fence. Neighbors slowed their cars to take pictures. Within days, photos of the mural hit social media, spreading faster than the HOA could contain. The board was furious. They demanded its removal, threatened steeper fines, even considered legal action. But the more they raged, the more attention the mural attracted. Strangers began to drive into Cedar Pines just to see the fence that had become an unlikely tourist attraction. What the HOA had meant to suppress had now gone viral, drawing light to their pettiness and cruelty. Marcus watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. His act of defiance had struck a chord, not just with his neighbors, but with people far beyond the gates of Cedar Pines. His fence had become more than wood and paint. It had become a stage, a billboard of resistance, a living symbol of how power can crumble when exposed to humor and truth. But with every car that slowed to take a photo, with every post shared online, the HOA's determination to crush Marcus only grew stronger. They couldn't let one man's rebellion unravel their authority. They couldn't let a fence define their defeat. And so, the battle lines were drawn deeper. What had started with a paint color was about to spiral into something far larger than Marcus had ever imagined. The fence was no longer just his fight. It had become a war of visibility, identity, and control, and the HOA was preparing its next move. The mural had barely dried before Cedar Pines transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet, uniform neighborhood was now buzzing with curiosity, irritation, and excitement. Marcus hadn't expected the fence to take on a life of its own, but that's exactly what it did. Every morning, as the sun rose and cast its light across the wood, neighbors lingered longer on their morning walks. Some smiled as they passed, snapping quick photos when they thought no one was watching. Others frowned, muttering under their breath about troublemakers and rule breakers. The fence was no longer just an object. It had become a stage, one that broadcast Marcus's defiance to anyone willing to look. The HOA board was livid. At their next meeting, the mural dominated the agenda. The president, a rigid man named Gerald, seethed as he spoke about property values and community standards. He slammed his papers on the table, furious that Marcus's act of rebellion had not only gone unpunished but had drawn attention the board could not control. The HOA had always thrived in the shadows of silence, sending letters, fines, and warnings that rarely saw the light of day. But now, their methods were being mocked publicly, their authority turned into art for everyone to see. What angered them most was not the paint on the wood, but the laughter it provoked. Meanwhile, Marcus watched with a mix of pride and nervousness as the spectacle grew. Cars began stopping on his street, outsiders driving in to see the billboard fence. Some visitors were locals from other neighborhoods fed up with their own HOA rules. Others were complete strangers who had stumbled across photos online. A few even asked to pose for selfies with the mural in the background. Marcus's wife, Denise, was torn. She admired her husband's courage, but she worried about the cost. The fines kept arriving, each one higher than the last. The board had begun threatening legal action, hinting at liens against the property. Denise feared they were playing a dangerous game, one where the price of defiance could be more than just money. Yet Marcus felt something deeper pushing him forward. For too long, rules had been used to silence voices like his, to enforce conformity and erase difference. The fence wasn't just a protest, it was a proclamation. It said, "We live here, we belong here, and we will not be erased." The mural continued to grow. Marcus added new sections week by week, each one sharper, funnier, and more pointed than the last. He painted Gerald, the HOA president, as a king sitting on a throne of paperwork, drowning in his own fines. He painted cartoon dollar signs spilling from the HOA's pockets. He even painted a bold phrase across the top panels, "My property, my voice." By the time local news outlets caught wind, the mural was impossible to ignore. A reporter showed up one morning, microphone in hand, eager to capture the story of the rebellious fence. Cameras rolled as Marcus stood in front of his creation, explaining how something as simple as a paint color had spiraled into a battle for autonomy. The segment aired that evening, and suddenly, Cedar Pines wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a headline. For the HOA, this was humiliation. They had wanted Marcus's defiance buried, quietly crushed with fines and threats. Instead, it had been broadcast across the city, their rigid enforcement painted as absurd and petty. The board scrambled to respond, but every statement they released only added fuel to the fire. The more they spoke of rules and uniformity, the more outsiders laughed at their obsession with control. Inside the neighborhood, divisions deepened. Some residents applauded Marcus privately, thanking him for standing up to the board. Others accused him of dragging their community into unwanted chaos. A few even joined the board's side, demanding that the mural be taken down immediately. What had started as a single act of defiance was now tearing Cedar Pines apart, neighbor against neighbor, whispers turning into arguments on sidewalks and driveways. And still, the fence drew crowds. Children giggled as they pointed at the exaggerated faces. Teenagers posed dramatically in front of the billboard. Cars parked along the curb, their drivers craning for a better view. Marcus's quiet cul-de-sac had become a tourist stop, buzzing from sunrise to sunset. But attention always comes with consequences. One evening, as Marcus watered the flowers near his fence, he noticed something unsettling. A black SUV sat idling across the street, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. It wasn't the first time he'd seen it. Over the past few days, similar cars had appeared, lingering near his home before driving off. He couldn't prove it, but Marcus suspected the HOA had hired private investigators, hoping to dig up dirt that could be used against him. Denise urged caution, her fear growing with each new letter from the board. But Marcus felt a stubborn determination harden inside him. The fence had already become bigger than his own fight. It was no longer just about paint, or fines, or even cedar pines. It was about resistance to control, about showing how power collapses when mocked in the light. Still, the HOA wasn't backing down. At the next meeting, Gerald announced their most aggressive plan yet. They would take Marcus to court. Their goal was to force the removal of the mural entirely, to not only erase the images but to set an example for anyone else who dared to resist. The news spread quickly, igniting even more outrage. By then, Marcus's fence had gained a following online. Thousands of people had seen the mural, many leaving comments of support and encouragement. Some even showed up to the neighborhood holding signs in solidarity, cheering Marcus on as though he were leading a protest march. For Marcus, the pressure grew heavier by the day. He stood tall in public, proud of his creation, but in the quiet of the night he worried about what would happen next. Could the HOA really take his fence away? Could they threaten his home, his family's future? And yet, as he looked out the window at the mural glowing under the streetlight, Marcus felt something stir inside him. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The HOA might have money, rules, and power, but Marcus had the one thing they couldn't control, a story that refused to be silenced. The billboard fence was no longer just his rebellion, it was a movement. And movements don't fade quietly. By the time the HOA formally announced their lawsuit, Marcus's fence had already escaped the boundaries of Cedar Pines. It was no longer a neighborhood spectacle but an online phenomenon. The local news story had been shared across social media platforms, clipped and reposted with headlines like "Homeowner turns fence into protest billboard" and "HOA control backfires in viral art display." What began as a mural on one man's property was now being debated by strangers hundreds, even thousands, of miles away. For Marcus, the sudden attention was surreal. He had gone from quietly painting his panels at night to waking up each morning to find hashtags, memes, and comment threads filled with opinions about his fence. Supporters hailed him as a creative rebel, a man brave enough to stand up against the absurdity of HOA control. Detractors called him reckless, selfish, even childish. But whether they loved or hated it, one thing was undeniable. People were talking and they couldn't look away. Cedar Pines, once the epitome of suburban uniformity, was now swarmed with visitors. Cars lined the streets, slowing traffic to a crawl. Strangers walked the sidewalks with phones in hand, narrating live streams to their followers. Food trucks even appeared, capitalizing on the crowds by selling coffee, hot dogs, and snacks to people who had come just to glimpse the billboard fence. The atmosphere in the neighborhood grew tense. Some residents welcomed the attention, seeing an opportunity for their homes to become more valuable due to the sudden publicity. Others were furious, claiming that the once quiet community had been destroyed. Arguments erupted on porches and lawns, neighbors accusing each other of either enabling or condemning Marcus. The HOA board found themselves in the center of chaos, their every move scrutinized not only by locals but by an online audience eager to watch the drama unfold. For Marcus and Denise, life became both exhilarating and exhausting. Reporters called daily, asking for interviews. Bloggers requested photos and quotes. Activists sent messages of solidarity, framing Marcus as a symbol of resistance against corporate and institutional overreach. And through it all, Marcus continued to paint. Each new addition to the mural carried more weight than the last, each brushstroke layered with meaning, humor, and defiance. He added depictions of faceless bureaucrats holding leashes, dragging homeowners like dogs. He painted towering fences closing in on a family, their faces sad and weary. In another corner, he painted a small child breaking free, running toward an open field. His art was biting satire, but also deeply emotional. It resonated with people because it spoke to something larger: the frustration of being controlled, the hunger for freedom, the small rebellions that mattered in ordinary lives. But while the world outside celebrated Marcus's mural, the HOA doubled down. Gerald, the board president, became more aggressive than ever. At meetings, his voice thundered as he condemned Marcus for turning their neighborhood into a circus. He accused him of damaging property values, embarrassing the community, and violating every standard they had worked to maintain. The lawsuit they filed wasn't just about the fence, it was about crushing the rebellion before it spread any further. In private, Marcus felt the pressure building. The HOA's legal threats were real. Their lawyers were relentless, sending letters filled with intimidating language. Denise worried constantly, her voice trembling as she asked what would happen if they lost the case. Would they lose their fence? Their home? Their savings? And yet, for every moment of doubt, Marcus found strength in the faces of the people who came to see his mural. Families posed for photos, children giggled at the cartoonish caricatures, and strangers whispered thank yous as they walked by. It was as if the fence had given people permission to laugh, to resist, to remember that authority could be challenged. The tipping point came when national media picked up the story. A major cable news channel ran a segment about the billboard fence, framing it as a modern-day battle between individual freedom and oppressive rule. The footage showed Marcus standing in front of his mural, his expression firm, his message clear. Almost overnight, the fence became a national talking point, debated on television panels and radio shows. Was Marcus a hero? A troublemaker? Or something in between? The attention brought more than just crowds, it brought chaos. News vans parked on the street, blocking driveways. Drone cameras buzzed overhead, filming aerial shots of cedar pines. Tour buses even arrived, unloading groups of people eager to see the fence firsthand. The HOA was overwhelmed, their attempts at control slipping further away with every passing day. The board tried issuing new rules, desperate to regain authority. They banned photography in the neighborhood, but visitors ignored them. They put up no parking signs, but cars still lined the streets. They even hired private security guards, but the guards were powerless against the sheer number of people showing up. And through it all, Marcus painted. The more the HOA fought, the more determined he became. His latest edition depicted Gerald himself, exaggerated and cartoonish, holding a giant gavel that shattered into pieces as it struck the fence. It was bold, risky, and utterly defiant. Neighbors gasped when they saw it, snapping photos before the paint was even dry. The image spread online within hours, fueling the story further. Yet Marcus knew this couldn't last forever. The lawsuit loomed ahead, threatening to undo everything he had built. The court date was set, and the HOA was confident they would win. They believed the law was on their side, that Marcus's art would be torn down panel by panel until nothing remained. But Marcus had something the HOA didn't. He had a story that had captured the attention of thousands, maybe millions. He had transformed a simple wooden fence into a canvas that spoke to people's frustrations, hopes, and laughter. And as the court date drew closer, he realized that even if the fence came down, the story would remain. Still, the uncertainty weighed heavily on him. At night, as the neighborhood quieted and the crowd disappeared, Marcus stood alone by the fence, staring at his mural under the dim glow of the streetlight. He wondered what the future held, whether he was building a legacy or inviting ruin. The silence pressed in, heavy and unyielding. And yet, in that silence he felt something else too. A spark. A resolve. The knowledge that he had already won something important. The right to be heard. The HOA could take him to court. They could bury him in fines and paperwork. They could even tear the fence down. But they could never erase the fact that, for one shining moment, a fence in Cedar Pines became bigger than rules, bigger than fines, bigger than fear. And that thought carried him into the storm that was about to come. The day of the court hearing arrived like a thunderstorm, heavy with tension and anticipation. 4 weeks, Marcus and Denise had lived under the weight of uncertainty, watching as the HOA's threats grew louder, their lawyers more aggressive, their accusations sharper. Every letter that arrived in the mail carried a sense of doom, stamped with warnings of fines, injunctions, and orders to comply. But now, the waiting was over. The battle that had been simmering behind fences and front yards was about to play out under fluorescent lights in front of a judge. The courthouse itself seemed to hum with expectation. News vans were already parked outside, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky. Cameramen clustered on the sidewalk, jockeying for the best shots of Marcus as he and Denise approached the entrance. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, hoping for a statement. Marcus kept his head high, his expression calm, but inside, his chest churned with nerves. He was not a politician, not a celebrity. He was just a man who had painted his fence. And yet, somehow, this simple act had dragged him into the public eye in a way he had never imagined. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. On one side sat the HOA board members, dressed in sharp suits, their faces stiff with determination. Gerald, the president, sat front and center, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with indignation. He had framed this case as more than just about a fence. It was about order, discipline, and the authority of the HOA. To him, Marcus was a threat to the entire structure of Cedar Pines, a symbol of rebellion that had to be crushed. On the other side, Marcus and Denise sat quietly, their lawyer whispering last-minute reminders. Behind them, the gallery was packed. Neighbors, reporters, activists, and curious strangers filled every seat, their eyes flicking between Marcus and the board. Some carried notebooks, others phones poised to capture every detail. For many, this wasn't just a court hearing. It was the climax of a story they had followed online for weeks. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, entered the room, instantly commanding silence. She reviewed the case with crisp efficiency, making it clear that this was not going to be a circus but a legal proceeding. Yet even her authority could not fully quiet the undercurrent of drama that buzzed through the room. Everyone knew that this case was more than paperwork. It was a battle of wills, a test of who held the real power in Cedar Pines. The HOA's lawyers presented their case first. They argued that Marcus's mural violated community bylaws, disrupted property values, and attracted unwanted attention. They painted him as reckless, selfish, and defiant, someone who believed he was above the rules everyone else had to follow. Their words were heavy with disdain, each argument sharpened like a blade. They pointed to photos of the fence, showing caricatures of the board, mocking slogans, and satirical images. To them, it was graffiti disguised as art, an eyesore that turned a respectable neighborhood into a media spectacle. Marcus's lawyer countered with calm precision. He argued that the mural was not vandalism but protected expression, painted on Marcus's own property. He highlighted the absurdity of fining someone for a paint color, framing the mural as a creative protest against arbitrary enforcement. He reminded the court that the HOA's rules were meant to maintain harmony, not crush individuality, and that Marcus's fence had sparked a larger conversation about freedom and control. Every sentence was designed not only for the judge but for the audience watching, both in the courtroom and beyond. As arguments unfolded, the tension thickened. Marcus sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his heart pounding in his chest. Denise's gaze never wavered from him, her presence a steady anchor. Gerald, on the other hand, shifted constantly, his jaw clenching tighter with every point Marcus's lawyer scored. It was as if the mural itself were on trial, each brushstroke dissected, every panel questioned. At one point, the HOA's lawyer presented a claim that the mural had caused property values in Cedar Pines to plummet. But the defense countered with evidence that home values had actually risen since the story went viral, thanks to increased visibility and demand. The courtroom buzzed at the revelation, whispers rippling through the gallery. Gerald's face reddened, his composure cracking for the first time. Then came the turning point. Marcus's lawyer displayed a series of letters and emails from neighbors and strangers alike, messages praising the mural, calling it inspiring, even healing. Families spoke of how the mural brought laughter into their lives, how it turned a bland fence into a beacon of creativity. Tourists wrote about traveling miles just to see it, spending money in the community along the way. The mural, the lawyer argued, had not destroyed Cedar Pines. It had put it on the map. The gallery erupted into murmurs of agreement, and the judge had to pound her gavel for silence. Gerald's face twisted with fury, but Marcus felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. For the first time, it seemed possible that the fence might stand, not as defiance, but as a testament. Still, the case wasn't over. The HOA's lawyer fired back, warning that if the court allowed the mural to remain, it would open the door for chaos. What would stop others from painting their fences with crude images, offensive symbols, or inappropriate slogans? Rules, he argued, existed for a reason, to prevent disorder, to keep communities livable. If Marcus's mural stayed, it would be the beginning of the end for Cedar Pines. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. The weight of the decision pressed on everyone in the room. For Marcus, each passing moment felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. One slip, and everything could come crashing down. When the hearing adjourned for the day, the tension remained unresolved. The judge announced she would deliver her ruling the following week, leaving both sides suspended in uncertainty. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed Marcus, demanding comments, while the HOA retreated with tight, bitter faces. That night, Cedar Pines was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time since the mural went viral, the crowds had thinned, the visitors dispersed. People were waiting now, holding their breath for the outcome. Marcus stood before his fence once more, staring at the images that had sparked such chaos and conversation. Under the dim light, the colors seemed to glow, each figure alive with meaning. He felt both proud and fearful, knowing that the story was reaching its climax. The fence had become more than paint on wood. It was a mirror, reflecting the struggle between control and freedom, conformity and creativity. And as the court prepared to deliver its ruling, Marcus understood that whatever happened next would define not just his fence, but his legacy. The week leading up to the judge's decision felt like a storm crouching just beyond the horizon, heavy and waiting to break. Cedar Pines was restless, split down the middle. Some residents were firmly behind Marcus, proud of the mural and the attention it brought, while others were furious, convinced it had made their neighborhood into a circus. The HOA board members walked with stony faces, whispering in tight huddles, while Marcus and Denise found themselves both praised by strangers and shunned by certain neighbors they had once greeted every morning. As the days ticked by, the atmosphere grew more charged. News outlets speculated endlessly about what the ruling might mean, not only for Cedar Pines but for HOAs across the country. Social media buzzed with hashtags, people using Marcus's fence as a symbol of standing up to oppressive rules. Supporters mailed postcards, dropped off flowers, and even left sketches of their own fences, decorated with imagined murals. Yet underneath the outpouring of positivity, a darker current was brewing. Not everyone celebrated Marcus's stand. To some, he was a troublemaker, an agitator who had dragged their quiet lives into unwanted chaos. It was late one night, only 3 days before the judge's ruling, when that anger turned into action. Marcus had gone to bed restless, his mind replaying the courtroom scenes, the uncertain expression of the judge, the biting words of the H's lawyer. Denise had managed to drift into uneasy sleep, but Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Then, around midnight, a strange sound jolted him upright, the muffled scrape of something sharp against wood. He slipped quietly to the window and froze. In the faint glow of the street lamp, he saw them. 2 figures hunched near his fence, shadows moving quickly, their hands working with brushes and spray cans. His mural, the images that had brought joy to so many, was being defaced in the darkness. Rage surged in his chest. He rushed outside, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. The vandals looked up, startled, their faces hidden under hooded sweatshirts. One of them sprayed a line of black paint across a caricature of Gerald, smearing it into an ugly blur, while the other scrawled giant words across the panels, "Destroy this eyesore." Marcus shouted, but they bolted, dropping a half-empty can of paint as they fled into the night. His voice echoed down the quiet street, unanswered except by the sound of their retreating footsteps. When the silence returned, Marcus stood alone before his fence, his heart pounding, his mural scarred with dripping streaks of black. Denise came running out, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She gasped at the sight of the vandalized panels, her hands flying to her mouth. Together, they stared at the damage, the paint still wet, the stench sharp in the air. It was as if someone had carved anger directly into their work, trying to erase not just the images, but the meaning behind them. Marcus spent the rest of the night cleaning, scrubbing at the vandalism with rags and solvent, his hands raw from the effort. Denise worked beside him, silent but determined, her jaw set in grim resolve. By dawn, much of the damage had been lightened, but the scars remained, ugly streaks running across the once bold colors. The mural was still standing, but it bore wounds that could not be hidden. When morning came, the vandalism was impossible to ignore. Neighbors stopped to stare, some shaking their heads, others snapping photos. The news vans returned in force, filming the damage, interviewing residents about what it meant. For Marcus, the attack was devastating, but for the media, it only added fuel to the fire. The narrative shifted again. The mural was no longer just an act of rebellion, but now the site of a crime, evidence of how deep the divide in Cedar Pines had become. The HOA board denied any involvement, issuing a curt statement condemning vandalism while simultaneously repeating their claim that the mural had disrupted peace in the community. Gerald appeared on local television, his tone dripping with smug certainty as he declared the vandalism proof that Marcus's fence was a catalyst for chaos. Yet even as he spoke, the cameras lingered on the black streaks running across the caricatures, turning the images into something rawer, more powerful. For Marcus, the damage became both a wound and a weapon. Supporters rallied even harder, raising funds for restoration, creating hashtags demanding accountability. Some called the vandalism cowardly, while others called it proof of why the mural mattered. The story that had begun with a fine for paint color had now spiraled into something larger than Cedar Pines itself. Still, beneath the growing attention, Marcus felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. The constant cameras, the endless debates, the looming court ruling, it was almost too much to bear. Denise worried for his health, noticing the way his shoulders slumped, the lines deepening on his face. And yet, every time Marcus looked at the scarred mural, he felt his determination harden. Someone had tried to silence him, to smear his message into nothing. But he refused to let them win. 2 nights later, a crowd gathered once more in front of the fence. Supporters carried candles, holding a vigil for what they called a work of freedom under attack. The soft glow lit up the scarred panels, turning the streaks of black paint into shadows dancing across the original colors. Voices rose in chants, not angry but resolute, filling the quiet neighborhood with a strange, haunting energy. That night, Marcus realized that no matter what the judge ruled, the mural had already changed things. It had sparked a movement, ignited conversations, and forced people to confront what freedom meant in their own backyards. The scars, as painful as they were, had become part of the story, proof that the mural mattered enough to be fought over. As the vigil ended and the crowd dispersed, Marcus stood with Denise, holding her hand tightly. The street was calm again, but the air was heavy with expectation. The ruling was only a day away now. By tomorrow, they would know whether the fence would be allowed to stand, or whether the HOA would finally tear it down. For Marcus, the waiting was unbearable. But deep down he knew one thing: the mural, scarred or not, had already outgrown Cedar Pines. And whatever happened next, the fight would not end here. The morning of the ruling arrived like a storm breaking over Cedar Pines. The quiet, manicured neighborhood that once prided itself on its calm lawns and whispering trees now looked like the epicenter of a national spectacle. News vans lined the entrance, cameras angled toward Marcus's street as though waiting for the final chapter of a drama that had gripped not only the community but thousands of people watching from afar. For Marcus and Denise, the weight of that day pressed heavily. They rose before dawn, unable to sleep, pacing through their small kitchen with the smell of coffee hanging in the air. Marcus looked out the window at the mural one last time before leaving, the scars of vandalism still visible but softened by the early light. Even in its wounded state, it stood tall, carrying a story that had become bigger than him, bigger than the HOA, even bigger than Cedar Pines. At the courthouse, the crowd was staggering. Protesters carried handmade signs demanding freedom of expression, while others shouted angrily for order in the community. News crews jostled for position, their microphones stretched toward anyone willing to give a soundbite. Gerald, the HOA president, marched up the steps with a grim, almost triumphant expression, while Marcus followed behind with Denise at his side, shoulders squared but nerves churning like fire inside him. The courtroom itself was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with tension. Supporters sat shoulder to shoulder, journalists scribbled furiously in notebooks, and every word spoken by the judge seemed to echo louder than usual. Marcus sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his palms pressed against his knees, as the HOA's attorney laid out their argument one final time, that the mural violated community rules, disrupted property values, and defied the authority of the board. Their words dripped with disdain, painting Marcus as reckless and irresponsible. But Marcus's lawyer countered with equal force. He argued that the HOA had overstepped its bounds, using fines and threats to suffocate individuality. He reminded the judge that the mural had drawn visitors, commerce, and life into Cedar Pines, things no one could deny. And most importantly, he argued that freedom of expression, even in a neighborhood governed by rules, could not be painted over by bureaucracy. The judge listened quietly, her expression unreadable, as the final arguments concluded. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, the kind of silence where every breath feels too loud. Then at last she spoke. Her ruling was deliberate, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. She acknowledged the HOA's authority, recognizing the purpose of rules in maintaining order. But she also acknowledged the uniqueness of Marcus's case, the mural's impact on the community, and the right of homeowners to resist overreach when those rules became unreasonable. The decision stunned the courtroom. Marcus would not be forced to take down the mural. The judge ruled that the HOA had applied its regulations inconsistently and had acted in bad faith when it targeted Marcus. The fines were dismissed, and the mural was allowed to remain, scars and all. Gasps filled the room, followed quickly by a wave of applause that rippled from the gallery. Marcus sat frozen, disbelief washing over him, before Denise gripped his hand tightly. Across the courtroom, Gerald's face burned with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might snap. For the first time, the unshakable power of the HOA had cracked, and everyone could see it. Outside, the news broke like wildfire. Cameras swarmed Marcus as he exited the courthouse, shoving microphones in his face, demanding reactions. Supporters cheered wildly, chanting his name, while strangers hugged Denise, telling her how much the mural had inspired them. Reporters broadcast live updates, declaring it a landmark case for homeowners' rights. Social media exploded, hashtags trending worldwide. Back in Cedar Pines, the victory unleashed chaos. Some residents celebrated, decorating their yards with small paintings and flags as acts of solidarity. Others fumed, insisting their neighborhood had been ruined by the circus. Gerald called an emergency HOA meeting, his voice trembling with rage as he promised new measures to restore order. But even he could see the tide had shifted. The mural had become untouchable, not just because of the judge's ruling, but because it now belonged to more than Marcus. It belonged to everyone who saw it as a symbol of resistance. In the days that followed, the fence transformed yet again. Artists from across the state traveled to Cedar Pines, leaving small additions on the mural with Marcus's permission. A child painted a bright sunflower, a veteran added a dove carrying a ribbon, and a local art teacher left a swirl of colors representing unity. Each brushstroke layered new meaning onto the panels, turning what began as one man's defiance into a living canvas of community expression. Tourists continued to flock to Cedar Pines, now more than ever. Vendors set up stands, local musicians played beneath the fence, and the once quiet cul-de-sac buzzed with energy. For Marcus and Denise, the chaos was overwhelming, but also affirming. They had not only won, they had sparked something lasting. Yet, amidst the celebration, Marcus often found himself returning to the fence late at night, when the street was finally quiet again. He would stand before it, running his fingers over the scarred panels, remembering the night of vandalism, the loneliness, the fear that it might all be taken away. The scars had not vanished, but in the glow of the streetlight, they seemed less like damage and more like proof that the mural had been tested, attacked, and still survived. Cedar Pines would never be the same. The HOA, once unquestioned, now faced constant scrutiny. Residents spoke up more often, challenging rules they once accepted silently. The board fractured, its authority weakened. Gerald himself eventually resigned, his legacy stained by the battle he had fought and lost. For Marcus and Denise, life moved forward with a strange mix of normalcy and notoriety. They still watered their plants, still waved to the neighbors they called friends, but they also answered letters from strangers across the country, people who wrote to thank them for standing up, for showing that even in the smallest of battles, resistance mattered. And so the fence remained, not just wood and paint, but a symbol, a landmark, a reminder of how one act of defiance could ripple outward until it changed everything. As Marcus looked at it one final time that summer evening, children laughing nearby and tourists snapping pictures, he thought about how it had all begun. A fine for the wrong color, a demand to conform, a punishment meant to break him down. Instead, it had built something stronger than anyone could have imagined. The fence that had once been ordinary was now extraordinary. And though battles would continue, here and in countless neighborhoods across the country, Marcus knew one thing with certainty. Sometimes, the smallest canvas can carry the loudest message. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.